Welcome to the City Club of Eugene's December 11th, 2020 program. The 2020 election, what happened and why? This is the 13th program of our 2021 programming year. My name is Scott Coltrane, and I'm the City Club President. Support for the City Club is provided by our members and our sponsors. You can become a member of the City Club at our website, cityclubofeugene.org. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page, and are rebroadcasts on public radio station KLCC 89.7 on Mondays at 7 p.m. We have both business and in-kind sponsors, including our diamond sponsors, Kaiser Permanente, University of Oregon, Peace Health, and Lane Community College, as well as generous support received from the City of Eugene and from Linn County. Today's program focuses on the fall 2020 election. The election of 2020 will undoubtedly go down in history as one of the most unique exercises in American democracy. Over 150 million voters voted by mail or came to the polls to render a verdict on who and what party should lead the nation over the next 4 years. Our forum today addresses who the winners were, what were the prevailing themes and issues, and what it might suggest for how America will be governed over the next 4 years. Two highly regarded members of the University of Oregon Political Science Department, Priscilla Southwell and Joe Lowndes, along with Phil Barnhart, a former long-serving member of the Oregon House of Representatives, will offer insights and impressions about the national, state, and local elections. Biographical information on our presenters is available at our website, cityclubofeugene.org. I would like to thank Skip Coburn for coordinating today's program. Each of our guests will begin with a brief opening statement. Priscilla, we'll start with you.
Hello, I'm Priscilla. I'm glad to be back here again. It's been 2 years, a completely different kind of election, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I have both a positive and negative reaction just initially to these elections. I was delighted to see that voter turnout was so high, 66.6%. Semi-officially, and that's the highest since 1900, as I'm sure many of you know about this. This is a delight to see. It's not all that unexpected because of the perceived closeness of the race. No matter what state you were living in, no matter what the polls said for your state or other states, I think people saw that the stakes were high and they turned out and voted regardless of what they expected the outcome to be in the nation or in their state. And so that's the really delightful thing. It's clearly due to the, as I said, the perceived closeness of the race, but it is, I need to underscore 3 times, also due to the fact that it was a lot easier to vote in this election. And this is the sort of amazing aspect about the COVID-19 effect, is that for as disastrous as it has been in our nation, it has allowed people to vote, and more of them vote, because they had various options. The rest of the nation is not, unfortunately, like Oregon. And so many of them, at least this time around, were given no excuse absentee ballots, or they were allowed, like Nevada, to emulate Oregon and just send out ballots to everyone. So 2 important reasons. The cloud behind the silver lining, as I see it, is that there was what I would call vote suppression, not voter suppression, which has been going on since 1787, where you discourage or do whatever you can to prevent the voter from voting, anything from poll taxes to not having enough polling places, ID requirements, all those things have been around. But this is a different, it's not voter suppression, it's vote suppression. So this is the phenomena which, unfortunately, I saw for the very first time in 2020, is when people actually did get to vote, but their vote wasn't counted. And that's the dismaying point about this. And I will sort of talk about this, and I'm going to use one of my favorite states, Pennsylvania, which is also in the midst of all these lawsuits, to give this as an example. So In Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court ruled in September that if a voter forgot to include the secrecy envelope when he or she cast a ballot, that vote was considered a naked ballot. New vocabulary this year. And so a naked ballot basically was just not counted. It was just tossed into a pile. And then, so this is unlike Oregon, as you probably know, that secrecy envelope or the secrecy sleeve that we have is optional. But in Pennsylvania and many other states, you forget this crucial step and your vote doesn't count, which the logic escapes me completely, but nonetheless, okay. And then there's other circumstances where a vote was not counted initially for legitimate reasons. You forgot to sign the outside of your mailing envelope, or you signed it with a signature that did not match your original signature when you registered to vote, or all kinds of other kinds of mistakes that people often make. So the controversy arose in Pennsylvania and other states, and this led to the lawsuit, which was when the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Kathy Boockvar, notified county elections officers, yes, these things happen. Voters make mistakes, especially since Pennsylvania was voting by mail for the very first time. And so she encouraged these counties in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, if there was enough time, or they deemed that there was enough time to notify these voters that had made this kind of mistake, whether it was the naked ballot or something else, that they could fix it or cure it. So this became the focus of lawsuits all over the place, but particularly in Pennsylvania, which was this notice and cure, quote unquote. And the Republicans were apparently incensed by this because they argue, this is under equal protection, that Republican counties didn't do this and Democratic counties did do that, so it was unequal. That of course is not empirically true. There were many Republican-leaning counties where they did notify and encourage a voter to fix his or her ballot. But that doesn't, the facts don't always matter. So that's the real problem here, is that there was an attempt, and I'm not going to be anything but frank here, by the Republican Party in Pennsylvania and other states to say, we don't like these ballots because they don't have the secrecy sleeve. We don't like these ballots because somebody made a mistake and a county clerk encouraged the voter to, or allowed the voter to fix it. Now in Oregon, this happens all the time. In fact, in this particular election, it happened twice in my family that one forgot to sign the mailing envelope, and these people are in their 30s and 40s, and the other person just has 5 signatures. And they were notified with a very polite letter from Multnomah County, hey, you have the opportunity to fix this, which they did do. So what do I say? Thank heaven we live in Oregon. I'll pass now the banner to my colleague, Joe Lowndes.
Thank you, Priscilla. I will talk maybe a little bit about the national picture of the election itself and maybe what it looked like. We now have all the county level data available to us, so we're not just working with exit polls now. And one thing that's clear is that not a whole lot changed from 2016. The lines drawn in that election remain largely unchanged, speaking broadly. Compared to 2016, 2020, there were some differences. There was less difference in vote by race and ethnicity, and urban areas and suburban areas voted more alike. But there were economic and education-related partisan divides, which did widen. Biden eked out a victory, narrowly in many cases, and the Democratic Party did not perform well down ballot. So in that way, it's a little bit starting to look like the Maginot Line during World War I. It's kind of a trench warfare where things are not really moving that much one way or the other. One thing that this means is that despite Trump's loss, Trumpism itself remains a very powerful political force. Trump brought out more voters in 2016 across the country than he did brought out more voters in 2020 than 2016, and 75 million voters. And that voting bloc is now rock solid. Trump is the first modern American president never to enjoy a majority approval rating in national polls. and yet he's had unwavering support from a consistent 40% of the eligible voting population. Their love for Trump has not been diminished by impeachment, 250,000 COVID deaths, or 8 million people suddenly cast into poverty. And that fact is crucial on its own. But what is even more important here is that the Republican Party seems to have been transformed over the last 4 years, really from top to bottom, into a far-right party, you know, a kind of a populist far-right party of the Central European variety. I was at the Republican convention in 2016 and interviewed dozens of delegates there. And at the time, there was still a lot of hesitation among the party faithful about Trump and about Trumpism. Among evangelicals, libertarians, moderates, conservatives, people who had supported one of the other 16 candidates in the primary race that year. But that's all behind us now. The party is very solidly among state level Republican activists, Republican voters, and national level elites as all kind of in the camp, or publicly in the camp of Donald Trump. As we know, there were over a dozen supporters of the QAnon conspiracy theory that ran for national office as Republicans, including the Republican candidate for the Senate here in Oregon. Far-right paramilitary groups supporting Trump called for civil war in state after state. And of course, the president and his allies have fought tooth and nail to disenfranchise the voters of Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, as Priscilla discussed, in the aftermath of the election. Now, something like 80% of Republican voters believe that the election was illegitimate, based on no real evidence, of course. And Republican political elites have, in the main, gone along with this, not saying that they support Joe Biden as having won the election, either not saying anything at all or claiming that every legal vote has to be counted and we have to see the process through, although it's unclear at this point what this means. There was the Supreme Court case that's supposed to be coming out of Texas right now. States are allowed to bring suits on behalf of states to the Supreme Court in the Constitution, although it's not clear for whom Texas is speaking in this case. So this means that in the kind of going forward, this idea of an illegitimate election is going to work as kind of a bulwark or a weapon to undercut the incoming president's administration at every turn. And I think this gives us some sense of what the political landscape then looks like in some ways over the next 4 years. And it's true, as I said, that Trump got larger white working class votes this time around, while Biden made real gains among wealthier and educated people. Trump made real inroads into the Latino vote in places that mattered, not just Miami or Dade County in Florida, but along the Texas-Mexico border, places like the Bronx. Really very disparate and different Latino voters came out for Trump in surprising ways. So there's a lot to talk about. And of course, elections are, as Priscilla knows as a fellow political scientist, very heterogeneous, there's many causal factors that go into any set of election results, and they can really differ because of local reasons and state reasons as well as national reasons. And you never fully know exactly what and how and why these things happen. All you can kind of do is look at the trends, things that change and don't change over time. But it appears right now, to me anyway, what this looks like. So now I will, in turn, pass the baton over to our esteemed public servant and former state legislator, Phil Barnhart.
Thanks, Joe. That's a great summary, I think, between the two of you of the national picture. My assignment has been to look at what happened in the state of Oregon in this election, and I think do a little comparison. By way of bona fides, I won 9 different elections for state representative, and I was on the House leadership team for about 7 of them, during which we had to strategize how to get from a minority party in the Oregon House to the majority party that we are now. So I know a little bit about the history of the way this system has worked in Oregon. This election, in one sense, is a return to normal, a return to type. Over many years now, since about 2003, the suburban parts of the state have been moving away from the Republican Party toward the Democratic Party. And I think the national results may be a little bit of a reflection of what's happening. For example, Washington County and Clackamas County in 2002 and 4 were almost entirely populated by Republican state senators and state representatives. Now the opposite is true, and that's the place where the shift actually took place. So this election is a continuation of the trends that have been occurring in Oregon for at least the last 20 years. As was true nationally, the Oregon turnout was the highest it's ever been in sheer numbers. As a percentage of the registered voters, it's not quite as big as a couple of earlier elections, but because of motor voter, that we register 16-year-olds now that when they go to get their driver's license, we have a lot more voters as a percentage of the population than we did back at those times when we had higher percentages of registered voters voting. I haven't done the arithmetic, but I do know that something in the neighborhood of 500,000 more voters now actually voted than we have had in any previous election. And the rural and urban voters have basically not moved very much. Portland, Eugene have always been Democratic strongholds. The very rural areas in Eastern Oregon have always been Republican strongholds. The shifts that we have seen lately have been really a continuation of that. Of the shift toward Democrats controlling the more urbanized and suburban areas, and Republicans the more rural areas. A couple of seats in the legislature moved from Democrat to Republican along the coast, which is really small towns and rural areas, while at the same time the Democrats picked up a crucial House seat in Bend that had been in Republican hands for quite a while. If you look at the statewide races, the races really are a return to normal. Democrats have basically controlled all the statewide offices for a long time, except for the election of Dennis Richardson in 2016 as Secretary of State. Shemia Fagan won that Secretary of State's race very handily, and with the same kind of splits as occurred in the normal statewide race that we expect to have happen. Dennis ran a really good campaign in 16, his opponent not so much. And so actually running a good campaign matters. In addition to that, 16 was the Trump wave. Lots of, as a percentage of the total voters, there were more Trump voters in 16, even in Oregon, where Hillary Clinton carried the state. But in 2020, the Trump voters came out, no question, but so did the Democrats who wanted to defeat him. And they voted mostly straight party line. Partly that's because they tend to do that, and partly because the campaigns that were run were actually pretty good campaigns. But now it looks like Oregon is very, very divided between urban and rural. But the fact is there are some things we agree upon completely. Measure 107, which allows the legislature to establish limits on campaign spending and on campaign contributions, passed every county in the state, every one. And it got almost 80% of the vote overall. So there are some things that we agree about, even between Republicans and Democrats, and people who disagree about a whole lot of other things. In fact, all of the statewide measures passed, some of them not quite so handily, and some of them more along the normal divides that you expect. But 107 is a real indication that Oregonians don't want their votes to be decided by outside money. They'd much rather have our elections to be decided by people in Oregon dealing with Oregon issues. The Trump effect was important. it caused a big scare for Peter DeFazio in House District, or in Congressional District 4. The Republicans ran a candidate, in my very biased opinion, simply not material for such a race. And yet he did very, very well and came within a few percentage points of winning because of the Trump effect in the southern part of the district. So it's not to be discounted, but also it did not lead to a significant result in the outcome of the elections in Oregon. We are about to go into redistricting. We are likely to pick up a 6th congressional seat. If that happens, the congressional calculus will shift in some significant ways. It's possible the Republicans will get a 2nd congressional seat in the incoming elections. It's also possible that the redistricting process will lead to a 5th Democratic seat. So that's the situation as it ends in Oregon. There are more things we agree about than what we disagree about, but we do disagree about partisan politics. And I think it's time for our pause.
Well, thank you for those opening statements. I have a list of questions here that I'd like you all to chime in on. First one is, what is the one lasting impression that stood out the most for you about the election this cycle? Priscilla, you want to start with that one?
Well, I think in the whole election cycle, I was amazed at how often the issue of voter fraud was raised, not just by the former president of the United States, but by a lot of people, and that it was blamed on or exclusively pointed at vote by mail. And I, who grew up in Chicago, even though I didn't vote in Chicago, I heard the stories from my parents and their friends about all kinds of things. I don't need to elaborate on that. So I think it's inevitable that there's going to be some amount of voter fraud, and it happens in polling place elections, it happens in vote by mail elections, and I think we have gotten better about detecting it and streamlining our process so that it's minimized. So it's the aspect that this was front and center issue all the time seemed to be, I think, very dismaying, because it led a lot of people who should have voted by mail to think, oh, maybe I'm not going to do this. This predominantly happened among Republicans who were following the president's lead, but it actually led a lot of people, especially with the concern about the U.S. Postal Service and whether their ballot was actually going to get delivered, especially given the budget cuts. All of this was just a mess all summer long. So it's not just what's swirling around now, it's really what the kind of taint to the election, and particularly vote by mail and absentee ballots, that really had no basis in fact. And, so, I've talked about this with my colleagues, and I think, there are so many studies that there's been so much analysis of the extent of voter fraud in both polling place elections and vote by mail elections, done by not only academics, but also seasoned election officials and think tanks. And they just basically say, sure, it happens, but really so rarely that we should not lose a lot of sleep over this. And we just need to move on and get people to vote and get people to talk about the issues. But again, as I've mentioned to many people, it's very difficult to prove that something has not happened. You can say we don't have any evidence of it. We can say we don't think it's a big problem. But if people are committed to this idea, and there seem to be a lot of people out there, not just Republicans, but primarily Republicans, who are convinced in this election that, and you can use what adjective you want to describe what happens. And they're still saying that Republicans are in Georgia, which is a little amazing to me, because it's almost as if they're trying to depress turnout in the state where they actually need to increase voter turnout in January, where even in Georgia, it's cold and a lot of people, fewer people typically vote in runoff elections. And yet they're saying, oh, boycott this, etc. And I heard when Mike Pence, the former vice president, was in Georgia saying, get an absentee ballot, he was booed by the crowd. his fellow Republicans. It's a mess. So instead of just talking about the mess and the morass of different opinions, which I think are really not based in anything empirical, I will just, New York Times called up election officials in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, and Democrat and Republican, they all said, we think the process was really, really smooth and full of integrity, despite a few bumps here and there. Misprinted ballots, etc. Okay, but aside from talking about the New York Times, that failing New York Times newspaper, I will refer to the Heritage Foundation, and I would encourage all of you to actually go to theheritage.org. They are a conservative think tank, I think that, or foundation, I think that's appropriate to say. They have compiled an election fraud database covering 20 years in all states. And what they have done is gone through and looked at all the proven instances of voter fraud. Okay, brace yourself. In 20 years, 50 states plus DC, they have come up with 1,302 proven instances of voter fraud. So get out your calculator. That's that amount. You divide it by 20, and then you divide it by, let's call it 51, and you're getting an average of 3 instances of proven voter fraud per year per state. Not going to determine an election, and in my opinion, not a widespread phenomenon. Now, there are going to be lots of skeptics out there who are going to say, well, those are the people they caught. Let's multiply that times 5. We're talking about 15 instances of all those other people that didn't get caught. 15 instances per year per state. So what can I say? To me, it's much ado about nothing.
All right, lasting impression, fraud, but not much of it, really.
Not much of it.
Right.
Joe, what was your lasting impression for the cycle?
Well, Joe? Okay, go ahead, Joe.
Phil, you want to go?
No, go.
Let me pick up from where Priscilla left off, because I think for me this question of fraud is the thing that leaves me with the most lasting impression. But partly it does in terms of the kind of political identities in the United States. In a way, there's a way in which the United States has now been kind of knocked off its pedestal as seeing itself as the kind of beacon unto the nations of being the most democratic nation, the oldest democracy, et cetera. And now we're a nation with real clear problems with with our democratic system, not in the way that Republicans have talked about it, but partly the way that we have had this kind of crazy system in place where every county in the United States can determine its own voting procedures, and so you have over 3,000 potential forms of voting. But as Priscilla pointed out, that doesn't mean that you're going to have more voting fraud. In fact, we have very little voting fraud. But one of the things that's happened, I think, in this election season is there's been, on the one hand, this extraordinary kind of civic flowering, this sense of like having to rediscover democracy, rediscover what democratic elections are about, how they function, how people can do them, how they might do them, in ways that we as a political science professor, I've been talking about this for years and years, and now it's kind of many people are have kind of ramped up their own understanding of these things, because the very question of democracy was one of the things at stake in the election, or 2 different versions of it. The Republican version was kind of an authoritarian, anti-democratic, anti-suffrage version of it, which is to say we need to shrink the electorate as much as we can. And that was the argument of saying we have to count every legal vote. The idea of counting every legal vote is to decide that certain ones are legal and the rest are outside of that. And so in a sense, we see kind of 2, kind of paths for the party. One party seeking to expand the electorate for partisan reasons, of course, but nevertheless seeking to expand the vote. The other party seeking to contract the vote, and through various measures. It used to be, we used to talk about just, as Priscilla said, the difference between voter suppression now and vote suppression. We have something where there are questions about whether or not people can exercise the franchise at all, which actually is on the one hand, exhilarating to see so much interest in democracy. On the other hand, a little disturbing to see a really diehard opposition to democracy and voting on the other hand. there was an activist, a right-wing activist in Arizona today, who tweeted out, asked Republicans if they're willing to die for their vote in Arizona. When they say for their vote, I mean their vote versus the one they have now deemed illegal. And Republican elected officials retweeted that, that tweet out. And so you have kind of a really strident partisan picture here, which is no longer just party competition, the way that we've always spoken about the United States, but kind of, from one perspective, authoritarianism versus democracy. So that was on the table, and I think it's unclear how this is going to play out, but it certainly is something that was central to this election in a way that we have not, in a way that maybe has been building up before, starting with the 2000 election, moving forward, certain kind of tendencies and lineaments, which kind of, travel in these ways. But this is really a sharp divide, and I think what has come before in terms of what we're seeing now.
Let me pick up on that sharp divide idea. I think that is a really critical item to understand what this election is about. The databases, the understandings, the facts that people from the different political positions have are diametrically opposed in many ways. And the result of that leads to this kind of discussion. It is absolutely correct that the strategies of the two parties when it comes to the issue of voter turnout versus voter fraud, these are mirror images of exactly the same issue. The Democratic approach, of course, as has been applied very clearly in Oregon for some time now, with the latest culmination of which is the motor voter registration issue. And then, of course, our very clear and our very well understood mail-in ballot system is designed to make it as easy as possible to vote and to encourage as many people as possible to vote. But that's because Oregon, of course, is a Democratic state. In the South and in other places, since Reconstruction, since the end of Reconstruction 150 years ago, the local strategy of the people in power has been to deny other people the right to vote. And this voter fraud argument is a continuation of exactly the same issue using new language. The reason why it's so important today is because the younger people, more moderate people, people who have been disenfranchised in the past are actually voting more in those states. Georgia is a fantastic example of that, with a very small win for President-elect Biden. And I think the distinct possibility that the Democrats might actually pick up 2 Senate seats, the ones they need in order to get to a majority. I know many people think that's nuts, but it's possible. And when you start actually getting people out to vote, you start getting the hope that, gee, my vote might actually matter, and gee, I actually can go do it. And here's the way I can do it, and here are people who are going to help me do it. When you do that in places like the Old South, you're going to get the kind of reaction that Priscilla referred to and John referred to in Arizona and in the South by those who have for a century and a half tried to figure out how to keep those other people from voting.
Great, thanks. So what do you think were the most important issues that motivated voters in this election? You think of a few specifics. Joe, you want to start with that one?
Well, it's funny. There are issues that motivated voters, I think, in the main. The economy clearly was one. We're, in the midst of an extraordinary crisis, and so many people thrown out of work, so many people with, the possibility they're going to be thrown out of housing, or if they haven't already. And, I think we have, now we've seen, the data, the job numbers have kind of really plateaued. And so I think that, the economy was one important one. And I think that one probably played in different ways for different kinds of voters. So if you, from one perspective, you saw this collapsing economy and you thought, we need somebody who can have a more progressive democratic vision, who can, can inject stimulus money and programs to kind of make sure that everybody is kept whole, or more people are kept whole. New jobs programs, this kind of thing that came from the Biden campaign. From another perspective, if you were a Trump supporter, you saw the economic near collapse is something that was caused by Democratic governors shutting down businesses, or the CDCs, or other health entities trying to wreck the economy. So economic crisis and economic anxiety, I think, was one of the big ones. But again, depending on how you interpret what the cause of our economic woes probably determined how people voted. And I think that differed in the industrial Midwest than it did from the Sun Belt South, and it did from parts of the Northeast or West.
Other issues?
Well, let me just add that I think this election was about Trump. And it motivated turnout among Republicans, and it motivated turnout among Democrats who voted opposite ways. I mean, in Oregon, you see that reflected in outcomes of races like the one I mentioned earlier about Peter DeFazio barely retaining his seat in Congress, and in the House District 11, my old seat, the Democrat Marty Wilde winning, but with a much smaller number than you would normally expect in that seat. The turnouts were huge, and I think the COVID issue, the issue of Trump's personality and his hollowing out of the federal government's operations, all of those things are important. And they played in opposite ways. And to make it simple, Trump is the only president lately who has never had a majority of public support, positives for his presidency during his entire time in office. And other presidents who did as badly as he did just before the election also lost after their first term in the recent past.
Priscilla?
I will just add that what I find, I mean, I agree with all of what you said, and I think COVID and the handling or mishandling of COVID and the economy are clearly intertwined. But what I found most interesting is, now that we have more data coming in, is to look at the counties or the districts that flipped. And a lot of this, of course, is not, I mean, suburban voters were already sort of moving a little bit toward the Democratic Party, even in 2016. But to look at those suburban areas that flipped away from Trump to Biden, a lot of them having to do with increased numbers of female voters that were might have voted for Trump in 2016, probably for purely economic reasons. These are well-educated, wealthy, often white women who did this because they may have agreed with his economic policies, wanted lower taxes, things like that. But it's not just so much his attitude and his demeanor that angered these suburban voters, primarily women, and caused them to flip. It was sort of just his, I think, and they were turning against their own self-interest, and they were also looking at what was happening to people who were not as privileged as they were, and saw, whether we're talking about immigration or we're talking about racial violence. The other group that I saw that flipped, and this is just recently, was places where military installations or military academies, or the Coast Guard in Bremerton, Washington, completely, I mean, not completely, nothing's ever complete, but that was one of the biggest flips. And you could, in that case, you do have to talk about his demeanor and his comments. I think about Arizona. It certainly didn't help his vote and his comments about former Senator McCain, deceased Senator McCain. Everything else about all the disparaging remarks he said about the military, I know that had an impact this year that I think I don't want to underestimate that.
Let's stay on this theme of voting blocks and demographics. What, if anything, does election tell us about the voting behavior of people of color? Voters of color, there were pitches that were a little different this time. And are there really blocks, Latin American vote, Asian American vote, any part of that you can comment about this election?
Joe, you should start.
Yeah, I'll start off here. One thing is clear is that the kind of presumption that if someone isn't white, they're going to vote against Trump, it was not borne out. And it wasn't actually borne out in 2016 either. But there's kind of I think sometimes liberal idea that why would any person of color vote for this, this clear racist? And, make no mistake, Trump has said, astoundingly racist things over and over, and he filled his first administration with people who are either white nationalists or close to it. But at the same time, there has always been elements of his kind of populist nationalism that has been meant to appeal to various constituencies among people of color. So, Steve Bannon would always talk about this new populist nationalist bloc, which would look like the New Deal, he would say. And he would go around to Black and Hispanic chambers of commerce and talk about how these people have been shut out of deals by the banks, and attempt to bring folks into this vision. And so that's one thing, is I think there are attempts from the very top of the Trump administration to appeal kind of in different ways to different constituencies of color. But the other thing is that these voting blocs, as you asked, Scott, are not even there, and there's no such thing as a Latino voter, or there's no such thing as the Latino community. These are wildly disparate groups, which are made up of South Florida. It might be Venezuelans and second or third generation Cubans who who fear the idea of socialism or social democracy. It might be Puerto Ricans who don't really have any necessary connection to the immigration issue at all, or third, fourth, fifth, or 10th generation Chicanos in the Southwest. So there are different groups that have different allegiances and alliances, and of course everybody has all kinds of different reasons for why they vote. There might be cultural reasons, there might be religious reasons, there might be reasons that fall along the lines of gender or class. And so, so part of it is that there's not going to be a people of color bloc, and there's not necessarily going to be blocks within that. There's also appeals that Republicans make in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of small business. There's all kinds of ways in which people are appealed to. Our old colleague Dan Hosang and I wrote a book on exactly this topic, about the way in which the right has made inroads and mobilized among different groups of people of color in a way that it's probably wise to attend to now, I think.
Priscilla, Phil? Okay, let's move on to the next one.
Yeah, I think we can go on.
Please go on.
Mentioned before, the blue wave didn't happen. I think, Joe, you mentioned that. But Phil or Priscilla, why do you think the blue wave didn't happen on the congressional races?
Well, the Republicans turned out, the Trump Republicans turned out, which they did not do in 18. I haven't done enough of a study to understand why many of the seats that the Democrats won in Congress in 18 went back to the Republicans this year. But I think there's another reason that nobody talks about very much, and that is the tactics that were used by the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the DCCC, were flawed. One of the things we learned in Oregon in 2003, when Jeff Merkley became the minority leader, was that you had to concentrate your efforts on the seats you could actually win. You ignored the seats you were going to win anyway. You ignored the seats that you were going to lose anyway. And you spent your effort and your money and your organizational capacity on the seats where it actually mattered. This time, they spent way too much. They broadened their approach way too much. They misperceived the idea. They thought they were going to increase their hold in Congress, in the House, rather than reduce it. And the result of that was that they were spread way too thin. Some seats that they could have held or picked up, perhaps, they did not, because they didn't concentrate their firepower. That is a problem that the Oregon House campaign did in 2010. The result was we lost 6 seats. We came out to a tie in 2011 in the legislature. And I think that's exactly what happened, at least in Congress. Now, that doesn't change the reality. Turnout was better for the Republicans because it was a presidential election. But it's also another indicator as to what the problem was nationally. And I know that the person who was the chair of the DCCC resigned the next day as chair.
Thanks.
I have to agree with that. I think there was probably a lot more money wasted, not just by the DCC, and on Senate races that were really, really kind of a stretch. I mean, I can say that with the benefit of hindsight, but to defeat Lindsey Graham would have taken more than just money. And so they raised a lot of money, spent a lot of money on that race. And if some of that had been funneled into these House races where the winner in 2018, the Democratic winner, had won by a smaller margin. I mean, let's look at the 5th Congressional District in Oregon. And the reason why the Republicans rightfully singled out that race as possibly winnable is because they looked at the margin, the very narrow margin between Clinton and Trump in 2016, and said, wow, there are a lot of people that may have voted for Peter DeFazio in both 2016 and 2018, but a lot of them are, can vote differently and can split their ticket. So they focused on the vulnerable Democratic incumbents. I'm not sure that the Democratic Party, in fact, I'm pretty convinced that they didn't follow that same strategy. I assumed that they would, because it's not rocket science. At least in terms of strategy, that's the best way to go. And I think, again, they wanted to go for the gold ring, the big prize, to defeat Lindsey Graham, to defeat Susan Collins, and those were, I don't think Susan Collins' race was a stretch as much as the South Carolina race was, and maybe even North Carolina. So maybe to lower your expectations and in planning. I mean, I think we'll see what the midterm elections are going to be like, in 2022, but I think I understand why that person resigned. I mean, still, I think a different kind of strategy is necessary.
Let's change the topic a little bit and talk about polling and projections. Why do you think the margin of victory for Biden was less than the pollsters predicted?
It wasn't.
It was not?
It wasn't. No, he did extremely well. He got he won in a landslide. The problem isn't, the problem is in some of those states where the electoral college vote is critical, and you have to win in those states as well as nationally. And so, I mean, I contest the idea that the polling was wrong. I think it was pretty much right on. The people who do evaluate these polls have suggested right along that the Democrats have to have very high margins in the polling in order to actually win. And that turned out to be exactly what happened.
I can just add to this. I mean, I think the error was not as large as it was in 2016 because they've added into their, I mean, it's very difficult to poll anybody these days, but they added more rural voters and whatever in the pool, so to speak, in 2020. I think this is a phenomena that is a little difficult to, in fact, impossible to prove, but I do actually believe in this view that polls often miss this social desirability bias, which is people are reluctant to admit that they're going to vote for so-and-so when their neighbors and their friends and maybe other family members have been very outspoken in why they're going to vote for candidate X. And that person who actually prefers candidate Y, even when there's a pollster calling them up or whatever, this is not necessarily lying, but it's sort of like that. And I think people do it, and it's okay. They usually refer to this as the shy Trump voter. And I think that's a phenomenon. I really do believe. I talked to a pollster about this after 2016, and he said what they do is they don't lie. They say they're undecided, when they really knew. They knew all along in 2016 they were going to vote for Donald Trump. And I think that phenomena has not disappeared, or did not disappear in 2020. And to give you a micro view of this, I have relatives in Maine, I guess actually a lot of us do, but anyway, and they say everyone is fed up with Susan Collins. Everyone talks about it all the time. These are, of course, Democrats who live in Portland, Maine. And yet, clearly, a lot of people were reluctant to oust her. She'd been around for a long time. She's a moderate Republican, and they might have been mad about certain things, but nonetheless, so they say, yeah, I agree, whatever, but they still voted for her. So there's a lot of this kind of, well, what are my friends and neighbors going to say if they find out that I'm really going to vote for this person? So yeah, there's no way to kind of get this, but it shows up also in surveys throughout, even when I was in graduate school before Oregon became the state. They would have this problem in terms of assessing racist viewpoints. You can't say to a person on a poll, are you a racist? What would you do if a Black person moved next? People won't admit. They won't admit it.
One thing I think Priscilla's exactly right. And another part of the shy Trump voter is that it's a core element of Republican identity that you don't trust the national media. So if someone comes and says they're part of a New York Times poll, you're not necessarily going to respond, or you're not necessarily going to respond truthfully, because you don't see those people as as unbiased agents in this whole thing as well. But the other thing, it's not exactly pollsters' fault. There's a public desire for the certainty that polling brings. When polls go up and we see them in their visual glory on computer screens, it gives you a sense of clarity about what you think is going on. It's an actual snapshot. And no pollster themselves will tell you they themselves will be much more circumspect about what these things mean than what we often take them to mean. Because I think we fetishize the statistics in a certain way. So it's kind of partly our own fault.
All right, we have enough time for a closing statement from each of you. Some of the questions we didn't get to were about what Biden can hope to accomplish because of divides, other things about Oregon specifically, closed primaries versus open primaries, things like that. If you want to touch on any of those things or anything else you think is important, give us your best shot.
I would like to make a very quick comment about what Biden's strategy ought to be. He ought to dump everything on the table as fast as he possibly can and do all of the things he can do by executive order in the first few weeks. The strategy that Trump used during his entire time was to have the scandal of the minute rather than the scandal of the week. You could never keep up with them all. Biden should use exactly the same strategy going ahead, but for things that actually will be beneficial for the country, for dealing with climate change, with healthcare, and with prosperity issues that Trump has botched so badly.
Joe.
I would only say, following up on Phil's comments on what Biden should do, I think one of the clear things that did seem to have come out of this election is, as we talked about before, that there's a class divide which has emerged, where it seems that there's kind of more of a working class vote for Trump this time around than last time, and a more of an educated and wealthy vote for Biden this time around than last time. And that potentially presents some problems going forward. And it makes the case for kind of an economic populism for Biden if he wants to expand the Democratic Party and move past this Maginot Line or trench warfare. All the progressives who took progressive strategies in these House races all won their races, and there's got to be clear, regional and local and state kind of economic initiatives to bring people in and to give them some vision or sense that there's going to be a survivable economic future as well as an ecological future. And so I think that some of these results should be read as opportunities to expand in new areas along those lines.
Priscilla.
So what I hope for Joe Biden, as well as for the majority party in Oregon, is that they try to find a way to be very different from Donald Trump and not be so divisive. I mean, it's just been so counterproductive from day one. of his administration. And it actually, I mean, he is the person, and this is a personal trait, but he's the one who could walk across the aisle and work across the aisle, and even actually came under fire in the primaries for that. And I think that's one of his greatest strengths. It doesn't necessarily mean you compromise on everything. He's going to have to establish priorities, and clearly one of them is going to be keeping healthcare to a certain extent what the ACA is, but maybe not the Biden plan. He's going to have strong priorities, but he's going to have to then maybe give, this is sounding very moderate for an immoderate person, but he's going to have to give on certain other issues. And I think the most important thing is to go across the water's edge and repair a lot of the damage. Again, a divisiveness between us and Europe and Latin America and Asia, and not just China. So, I mean, this is my real hope, is that at least we don't have to have all of this constant infighting, even within the Republican Party, but across parties, across countries, across even the Democrat and Republican members of the state legislature.
I love your optimism.
Okay, good. I'll talk to you in 2 years.
Thank you, all three.
Well, thanks for having us.
This has been our December 11th, 2020 program, the 2020 election, what happened and why. Before we proceed, I'd like to recognize our diamond sponsors. Kaiser Permanente exists to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information at www.kp.org. Support comes from the University of Oregon. Since 1876, UO has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically. More information at uoregon.edu. Peace Health is proud to serve Eugene, Linn County, and beyond. As your hometown healthcare partner for more than 80 years, our mission is to keep you and your family healthy. Learn more at peacehealth.org. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. I would also like to acknowledge some gold sponsors: Luvas Cobb, Attorneys at Law, Jerry Diethelm, Architect and Landscape Architect, and AARP of Oregon. Before we thank our speakers today, there are a few more quick announcements. Thank you to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, PAC Info and Simplified Computing LLC, and Dot Dotson's Photography. And a special thank you to public radio station KLCC 89.7 for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7 p.m. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. Next week, we will have our Gifts to the City program. In this annual program, the City Club invites people from different corners of our little world to imagine they have been given a magic wand with the sole purpose of conjuring up a gift that would perfectly meet our collective need. We ask them to give this virtual gift to the city. In a year when we have been removed from our public collection some monuments, and those monuments have passed their prime, we encouraged givers to imagine filling those spaces with new monuments, symbolizing the message of their gift to the city. We are honored to have the Reverend Dan Bryant join us again as MC. We will be joined by Jeanette Keim, Joel Eboa, Jennifer Skurlock, Tim Black, Kamala Mortensen, Midas Well, Timothy Inglesby, Mustafa Kasubai, Emily Hallman, and Sarah Maderi. Please join us again on Friday, December the 18th for Gifts to the City. More details and information about future programs can be found online at the City Club's website, cityclubofelugene.org. You may submit questions for the speakers at the same website address, cityclubofelugene.org. Now, I would like to thank today's speakers for a great program. Priscilla Southwell, Joe Lowndes, and Phil Barnhart, thank you so much for an enlightening program. This concludes today's program. Be well and stay safe.